Elizabeth Rogers never imagined her life would turn upside down with a simple slip of paper. Working the late shift at Millwood's cafe, she was used to cranky customers, small tips, and a never-ending battle against exhaustion. But on this particularly quiet evening, a stranger with kind eyes and an air of mystery left something behind with his payment. Tucked inside the leather bill holder was a note that read, "From your father, the millionaire." Her heart hammered in her chest. How could this be? She didn't even know the man who claimed to be her father. In that moment, life as she knew it changed forever. Elizabeth Rogers had always been told her father vanished when she was a baby. Her mother, Rebecca Rogers, offered few details. It was a topic so painful they rarely revisited it. Growing up in a small coastal town, Elizabeth dreamed of one day escaping the shadow of her family's painful secrets. But life had other plans. Financial troubles forced her to remain close to home. Working double shifts at Millwood's cafe, she poured coffee and served plates of scrambled eggs just to keep the rent paid on her tiny apartment. She never expected that one day, fate would bring her father back. Rebecca Rogers was a strong-willed woman, the kind who never showed weakness in front of her daughter. When she spoke of Elizabeth's father, Daniel Hastings, it was in hushed tones. She would say, "He's gone, and that's all there is to it." For most of Elizabeth's childhood, she accepted that explanation. If her father had truly cared, he wouldn't have left in the first place, or so she believed. Only during long, lonely nights, when Elizabeth heard her mother weeping through the thin walls of their tiny house, did she suspect there was more to the story. Much more. At 22, Elizabeth found herself juggling responsibilities no young person should face alone. Her mother's health had begun to decline. Doctors' visits and mounting medical bills meant Elizabeth had to pick up even more shifts at the cafe. Yet she never complained. She thought of herself as ordinary, someone whose existence would never attract the attention of a millionaire. The sight of that note from your father, the millionaire, was incomprehensible. Had her mother lied all those years? Or was this man some imposter? One thing was certain, the note threatened to unravel everything she believed about her life. The note came one Thursday night, just before closing. Elizabeth was wiping the counter, trying to chase away the musty smell of burnt coffee. Only 2 customers remained. One was an elderly woman sipping chamomile tea, flipping through a magazine. The other was a distinguished man in a tailored suit, probably in his late 50s. He had salt and pepper hair and a gold watch peeking from beneath his crisp cuff. There was something regal about him, an air of confidence that drew curious glances from the other patrons. Elizabeth had taken his order and delivered his meal, but he barely spoke. He finished eating, placed a credit card in the leather holder, and nodded politely toward Elizabeth. She hurried over, thanked him with her usual bright smile, and carried the holder back to the register. When she opened it, her eyes immediately landed on a slip of paper that seemed out of place. Her fingertips tingled as she read the words scribbled in bold handwriting, "From your father, the millionaire." She looked up in shock, only to see the man pushing the door open, stepping into the night. By the time she rushed outside, the sidewalk was empty. He was gone. Elizabeth's heart pounded. Her mother had always referred to her father as Daniel, never using his last name. She claimed he'd been a wanderer, a man without ambition who couldn't hold a job. Yet, here stood evidence that he was apparently wealthy, so wealthy that he casually dropped hints of a lavish life. Did that mean her mother had lied? Or had circumstances changed drastically for him over the past 2 decades? She looked down at the slip of paper again, her breath fogging in the chilly air. Unsure if she was trembling from the cold or sheer shock, she returned inside. She couldn't shake the revelation. All night, she tossed and turned in her bed, reading the words in her mind. The next morning she confronted her mother. Rebecca, pale from her recent chemotherapy session, sat at the kitchen table sipping tea. Her eyes widened when Elizabeth showed her the note. It was as if time froze, then a deep sadness clouded Rebecca's gaze. For a moment, she looked ready to speak, to finally unload the secrets she'd carried for years. But she clamped her mouth shut, tears welling up. "It's not safe," Rebecca whispered, voice trembling. "He's dangerous, Liz. Dangerous?" Elizabeth reeled at the suggestion. How could her father be both dangerous and a millionaire, yet suddenly appear at her workplace? Why now? Her mother refused to elaborate. Instead, Rebecca simply placed a trembling hand over Elizabeth's and begged her to leave this alone. "We're fine," she said weakly. "We don't need him." But Elizabeth knew they did. Medical bills were piling up. The bank had called about late mortgage payments, and Elizabeth carried a desperate wish to see her mother healthy and happy again. If Daniel Hastings truly had money, maybe he could help. Still, fear gnawed at her. Determined to find the truth, Elizabeth decided to investigate. She began by asking her co-workers if the mysterious man had visited before. Millwood's cafe wasn't a tourist spot, so new faces stood out. Most people shrugged. Until Rosie, a fellow waitress, mentioned she'd seen him a few times over the past month, always alone, always at odd hours. He tipped generously, but never spoke more than a polite greeting. It was as though he was silently observing Elizabeth, waiting for the right moment to leave that cryptic note. The realization sent chills down her spine. How long had he been watching? Elizabeth's next move was to search for any local rumors about a wealthy businessman named Daniel Hastings. She turned to Google first, typing in the name along with millionaire, but the results were overwhelming. There were dozens of Daniel Hastings across the country. Some were real estate moguls, others were tech entrepreneurs, but none had the details that matched her family's story. Undeterred, she visited the local library, combing through newspaper archives for any mention of a Daniel Hastings who might have lived in Cedar Falls or the neighboring region. Days passed with no meaningful clues. Still, she refused to give up. One evening, her mother's condition worsened. Rebecca doubled over with pain, and Elizabeth rushed her to the hospital. While waiting anxiously for test results, Elizabeth replayed her mother's warning about her father. "He's dangerous." Could Daniel have hurt her mother in the past? Why else would Rebecca hide so much? Yet, part of Elizabeth wondered, if Rebecca had said so to shield her from heartbreak, perhaps Daniel simply chose to leave. Now that her mother's health was in a precarious state, Elizabeth felt a pressing urgency. She needed answers. If Daniel truly was wealthy, maybe he could save Rebecca in time. The hospital hall smelled of antiseptic, their fluorescent lights illuminating Elizabeth's drawn face. When the doctor approached, Elizabeth braced herself. The news was a mix of relief and dread. Rebecca had an infection that complicated her ongoing treatment, but with the right care, she could still recover. The cost, however, would be astronomical. Elizabeth felt a stab in her gut. She had no money, and their insurance only covered so much. That night, alone in her mother's hospital room, she gazed at the flimsy slip of paper with the mocking words, "From your father, the millionaire." It felt like a lifeline, albeit a cryptic one. As Rebecca slept, Elizabeth wrestled with a moral dilemma. Should she try to track down Daniel Hastings, risk opening old wounds, and beg for financial help? Or respect her mother's wishes, ignoring this entire fiasco? The memory of her mother's tears won out. She recalled nights when Rebecca cried herself to sleep, mumbling regrets about someone named Daniel. Each time Elizabeth asked, she was told to never mention that name. But how could Elizabeth turn away from the one person who might fund Rebecca's life-saving treatment? The conflicting emotions churned in her stomach until dawn broke, and with it, a decision. She returned to Millwood's cafe for her shift, nerves on edge. Perhaps if the mysterious customer showed up again, she could confront him directly. Hour after hour passed. By closing time, there was still no sign of the man in the tailored suit. Disappointed, she locked up, stepping into the cool night air. That's when she spotted him standing under a flickering streetlight across the road. Her heart leaped. Before fear could stop her, she marched across the street. He inclined his head, acknowledging her approach. Up close, Elizabeth noticed the fine lines around his eyes and a hint of sadness there. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to steady her trembling voice. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, in a husky whisper, he replied, "I'm Daniel Hastings." Elizabeth's pulse pounded. This was her father, or someone claiming to be. "Why now? Why leave that note?" she pressed. He hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being watched. "Because you're my daughter," he began haltingly. "And I wanted to help before it's too late." Elizabeth's mind spun with questions, but one overshadowed them all. Too late for what? Daniel didn't explain, simply reached into his wallet and handed her a business card. She glanced at the card. Embossed in gold letters was Hastings and Associates, followed by a New York address. Below, in neat handwriting, was his personal number. "If you need me," he said, his voice trembling, "call." Before she could protest, Daniel turned and strode away. Elizabeth stood there under the flickering streetlight, torn between anger and curiosity. This man claimed to be her father. He clearly had means no ordinary person carried such an opulent business card. But was he truly a millionaire? And what did he mean by "before it's too late"? All she knew was that she needed answers. Back at the hospital, she found her mother asleep, her chest rising and falling in frail shudders. Elizabeth clenched the business card. Regardless of how complicated this was, she had no choice but to act. The next morning, she slipped out into the corridor and dialed Daniel's number. Her stomach twisted in knots as it rang once, twice. On the third ring, he picked up. "Elizabeth?" he asked, sounding both hopeful and afraid. She took a deep breath, summoning courage. "We need to talk," she said. Moments later, they agreed to meet at a quiet bistro near the hospital. The bistro was a quaint, sunlit spot with pastel walls and a scattering of potted plants. Elizabeth arrived early, sipping a cup of tea she couldn't taste. She wore her simple work uniform, an old blouse and black slacks, self-conscious in a place where cappuccinos cost half her hourly wage. Finally, Daniel appeared, wearing another tailored suit. Eyes turned in his direction as though drawn by his aura of wealth. He removed his sunglasses and sat opposite her, politely inquiring how she was. Elizabeth couldn't hold back. "Cut to the chase," she said. "Are you really my father? And if so, why now?" Daniel sighed, placing his hands flat on the table. "Yes, I'm your father. I never meant to leave you behind, Elizabeth. There were extenuating circumstances." His gaze flicked to the floor. "I did things I'm not proud of, and your mother wanted to protect you." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "You were never around, never paid child support. Now you waltz in and drop hints that you're rich?" He swallowed, nodding. "I came into money later. After I left Cedar Falls, I made some good investments, started Hastings and Associates. I've been trying to find the right way to reach out for years." "What do you want from me?" Elizabeth asked, her tone laced with both bitterness and desperation. Daniel's face softened. "I want to help. I know your mother is sick. I heard rumors in town." Shock flared in Elizabeth's eyes. "You've been checking on us?" He nodded. "Discreetly, I was told she's struggling with her bills. If there's anything I can do..." His voice trailed off, genuine concern etched in his features. Elizabeth hesitated. On one hand, he was the father who abandoned her. On the other, he seemed sincere, and they desperately needed financial assistance. Her heart pounded with conflicting emotions. "What if you just give me the money for her treatment?" Elizabeth asked, eyeing him warily. "Would that be enough for you to atone for everything?" Her words had a harsh edge. Daniel flinched, but didn't look away. "I'm prepared to pay for all of your mother's treatments, any additional care she needs," he said quietly. "But in return, I want a chance to be in your life. I want to explain what really happened, to show you I'm not the monster you believe me to be. Elizabeth's hands shook around her teacup. Was he truly seeking redemption or manipulating her? They spoke for over an hour. Daniel revealed bits and pieces of a past Elizabeth never knew. He claimed that 22 years ago he'd been involved in shady dealings, debts owed to dangerous people. When threats began surfacing, Rebecca insisted he leave Cedar Falls to protect them. Fearing violence, Daniel severed ties, planning to return only when it was safe. "I never expected it to be this long," he said, guilt heavy in his voice. "But by the time I could come back, I was too ashamed. I'd missed your childhood, missed all those milestones." It felt impossible to make it right. Elizabeth was left reeling. Could it be true, or was this a carefully spun tale to justify his absence? Regardless, she couldn't deny the relief that coursed through her when he offered to settle the medical bills. Later that day, Daniel accompanied her to the hospital finance office, quietly writing a check that would keep her mother's treatment going. The nurses exchanged glances, curiosity piqued by this well-dressed benefactor. Elizabeth felt numb. She was grateful, yet overwhelmed by the magnitude of this sudden change in fortune. Her father, the millionaire, was stepping in to save her mother's life. Rebecca was furious when she found out. Her eyes, clouded by painkillers, burned with anger. "Liz, how could you bring him here?" she rasped from her hospital bed. Elizabeth pressed her mother's hand. "He's paying for your treatment, Mom. Isn't that good?" Rebecca shook her head, tears forming. "Don't you realize what he's capable of? He's dangerous, Liz. Not just because of his past dealings, but because there are secrets he hasn't told you." The nurse ushered Elizabeth out, insisting Rebecca needed rest. Elizabeth stood in the hallway, heart pounding. What more could her mother be hiding about Daniel Hastings? That night, Elizabeth found a stack of old letters in her mother's bedside drawer. They were addressed to Rebecca Monroe, her mother's maiden name, postmarked from a prison in upstate New York. Intrigued, Elizabeth opened one. It was from Daniel Hastings, written years ago. His words were filled with remorse for betraying your love and risking our safety. He spoke of a heist gone wrong, of hush money to keep dangerous people quiet. Elizabeth's stomach lurched. Prison? She scanned the dates. Daniel had been incarcerated for several years, far longer than he'd let on during their conversation. Anger flared at his dishonesty. Confusion and betrayal churned in Elizabeth's mind. Why had Daniel lied about the full extent of his criminal past? Was his success as a millionaire built on dirty money? The next morning, she confronted him at the cafe. He looked uneasy, fiddling with his coffee cup. "I never said I wasn't in prison," he muttered. "I just didn't think you needed all the details." Elizabeth's voice shook. "I deserve the details, and so does Mom. You can't just drop this on us and walk away again." Daniel let out a heavy sigh. "I'm trying, Liz, but some parts of my past are dangerous." Over the following weeks, Rebecca's treatment continued, financed by Daniel. The tension between him and Rebecca was palpable each time they crossed paths in the hospital corridor. Rebecca refused to speak to him. She'd let him pay, but her bitterness ran deep. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was torn. She was thankful for his financial rescue, yet resentful of his dishonesty. Each day, she tried to piece together the puzzle of who Daniel Hastings really was. He seemed genuine in wanting to build a relationship with her, yet ominous hints of his criminal history kept surfacing, fueling her doubts. Just as Elizabeth started to inch toward trusting him, a new twist shattered the fragile peace. Late one evening, while organizing her mother's paperwork, she discovered an old photograph tucked behind the hospital bill. It showed Rebecca, heavily pregnant, standing beside a man whose face was partially cropped out. In bold writing on the back, it read, "Rebecca, Daniel, and baby Harriet, 1998. Baby Harriet? Elizabeth frowned. She'd never heard of a sister. The family tree she knew contained only herself, her mother, and an absentee father. Who was Harriet, and what had become of her? Trembling with confusion, Elizabeth confronted her mother the next morning. Rebecca, weak from chemotherapy, reluctantly confessed. Harriet was Elizabeth's older sister, born 2 years before Elizabeth. Daniel got involved with dangerous people, Rebecca whispered. One night, we had to flee. We left Harriet with my sister, Marjorie, thinking it was only temporary. But then the threats escalated and we lost contact. By the time it was safe to look for Harriet, Marjorie had vanished. Elizabeth felt her knees buckle. She'd grown up thinking she was an only child. Now she discovered there was another child, lost somewhere in the world. Guilt flooded Rebecca's features. I should have told you, she said, tears streaming. But the shame, the pain of losing Harriet, it was too much. We eventually moved to Cedar Falls, and I tried to give you a normal life. Elizabeth's mind reeled. How could Daniel keep such a secret too? Did he even know Harriet was missing? She closed her eyes, remembering the cryptic phrase Daniel had used, before it's too late. Was Harriet the key to all of this? Could Daniel have returned, not just because of Rebecca's illness, but also to finally unearth Harriet's whereabouts? Elizabeth wasted no time. She confronted Daniel again, this time in the hospital cafeteria. He looked weary, dark circles under his eyes. Mom told me about Harriet, Elizabeth said, her voice low. Daniel's face went ashen. I tried to find her, he whispered, guilt threading his words. I tracked Marjorie from Texas to Arizona, then she disappeared. I hired a private investigator, but by then, so many years had passed. I was in prison at one point, remember? Harriet was lost in the system. After I was released, I swore I'd make enough money to fund a thorough search, but I failed. The revelation hit Elizabeth hard. She imagined a lonely sister, raised by strangers, unaware of her true family. Anger mingled with sadness. How could you both keep this from me? She asked, tears in her eyes. I had a sister out there all along. Daniel shook his head slowly. Your mother and I couldn't even face our own guilt. Every time I looked for Harriet, I hit a dead end. Then I started Hastings and Associates, hoping money would help me track her. It's haunted me for years. Elizabeth saw genuine sorrow in his expression. For the first time, her anger softened. She promised herself she wouldn't make excuses for him, but it was impossible not to see a father tortured by regret. Over the next few days, Elizabeth witnessed a subtle shift. Daniel spent more time with Rebecca, ensuring she had everything she needed. He arranged for top specialists to consult on her case. Despite her lingering resentment, Rebecca had to admit the care was exceptional. Elizabeth, meanwhile, dove into the search for Harriet. With Daniel's resources, they hired investigators to comb through old records, adoption agencies, foster home logs. Each day, Elizabeth woke with renewed hope that Harriet might be found. Weeks turned into months. Rebecca's health stabilized, though she remained weak. Daniel, balancing his business, made frequent trips between New York and Cedar Falls. Each time he returned, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes in her feelings. She no longer saw him merely as the villain who abandoned her. His kindness, his unwavering support, his evident remorse all chipped away at her defenses. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, she found Daniel hunched over a stack of documents in her kitchen, cross-referencing addresses. He looked up, exhaustion etched in his features. I think we might have a lead on Harriet, he said. The lead traced Harriet to a foster home in Street Louis. According to records, a girl named Harriet Monroe had been placed there at age 4. It was the last official record before she was moved again. Daniel's investigator managed to find the next location, a foster care facility run by a woman named Charlotte Henderson. Excitement and anxiety gripped Elizabeth. Could Harriet still be there, or at least could Charlotte remember her? The next morning, Daniel booked a flight for them to travel together. Rebecca, too frail to go, insisted Elizabeth keep her updated. Hope blossomed in their hearts. Arriving in Street Louis, Elizabeth felt her stomach flip. She'd never left Cedar Falls before, and now she was on a personal mission to find the sister she never knew she had. Daniel tried to comfort her. "Whatever happens, we'll do it together," he said softly. They drove through unfamiliar streets until they reached a small, nondescript house on a quiet cul-de-sac. This was where Charlotte Henderson lived. Inside, the smell of lavender and old wood welcomed them. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted them politely. When Daniel explained they were searching for Harriet Monroe, Charlotte's face turned solemn. Charlotte nodded slowly. "I remember Harriet, a sweet, quiet child with big brown eyes. She stayed with me for about a year, then the agency placed her elsewhere. I'm sorry, but I don't have much information." Elizabeth's heart sank. Another dead end. "Is there any clue you can give us?" Daniel pressed gently, desperation in his voice. Charlotte disappeared into another room, returning with a faded folder. Inside was a single photograph of Harriet, maybe 5 years old, standing in a park. "That's the only picture I have," Charlotte said softly. Elizabeth stared at her sister's face, tears burning her eyes. The photograph was heartbreakingly precious, capturing a fragile child with uncertain eyes. Charlotte hesitated, then said, "There's one thing. Harriet used to talk about an aunt named Marjorie. She believed her aunt would come for her someday. She held on to that hope fiercely." Elizabeth clenched her fists. Had Marjorie abandoned Harriet intentionally, or was something else at play? Charlotte added, "I believe Harriet ended up in a children's home run by the St. Matthew Foundation. Maybe they have records." With renewed resolve, Elizabeth and Daniel thanked Charlotte, vowing to continue their search. Harriet had to be found. The St. Matthew Foundation's children's home was on the other side of the city, a large brick building with a neglected playground. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she and Daniel walked inside. A stern administrator greeted them, scanning through old files. Eventually, she found Harriet's name in a dusty ledger. Harriet Monroe was here for 2 years, then was adopted by a couple named James and Maria Nelson. This was approximately 15 years ago, the administrator informed them. Elizabeth exhaled in relief. Harriet had been adopted. That meant she might have a stable family, a new life, somewhere. With the adoptive parents' names, Daniel pulled every string possible. They found an address in rural Missouri, over an hour away. Without hesitation, they drove out, navigating winding roads and sprawling farmland until they reached a modest, well-kept house. Elizabeth's heart hammered as she approached the door. She knocked, pulse racing. A middle-aged woman answered. Daniel spoke up, voice trembling. "We're looking for Harriet Nelson. She might have been adopted here." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition. "Harriet? Yes, please come in." Inside, the living room smelled of fresh bread and reminded Elizabeth of the homey atmosphere she'd craved as a child. James and Maria Nelson were warm, gracious hosts. They invited Elizabeth and Daniel to sit on a comfortable couch. There was a slight tension in the air as the couple exchanged looks. Finally, Maria spoke. "We adopted Harriet when she was 7. A beautiful, quiet girl who'd been through a lot of trauma. We loved her like our own. But," she hesitated, glancing at James, who continued the story, "when Harriet turned 16, she grew restless. She wanted to find her birth parents. We couldn't provide answers. Eventually, she ran away." Elizabeth's heart sank. Harriet was gone again. How many times had she been lost? Elizabeth clenched her fists. This was a cruel cycle. Each time they found a lead, Harriet had slipped through the cracks. Maria saw the despair in Elizabeth's face. "We tried for years to track her down. She would send postcards sometimes, always with minimal words, just 'I'm safe, don't worry.' Then they stopped. That was about 2 years ago." Elizabeth felt tears gathering. Daniel, his face ashen, asked if they still had the postcards. Maria brought out a box of keepsakes. Inside were old pictures of Harriet as a teenager, wearing braces, hugging a pet dog, blowing out birthday candles. The postcards were all addressed from random cities: Memphis, Chicago, Atlanta. Elizabeth flipped through each postcard, searching for clues, a date, a location, anything. She noticed a pattern. Harriet never stayed long in one place. She'd mentioned found a new job or heading to see an old friend. One postcard from 3 years ago caught Elizabeth's eye. It was from Cedar Falls. Shock jolted her. Harriet had been in her hometown at some point. The short message read, "I think I saw them today. Not sure. Leaving tomorrow." The back featured a photograph of the Cedar Falls Riverwalk. Elizabeth's mind spun. Had Harriet briefly seen Rebecca, or even Elizabeth herself? The notion that Harriet had crossed paths with them unknowingly broke Elizabeth's heart. She clutched the postcard tightly. "Thank you for showing us these," she whispered, voice unsteady. Daniel asked, "Do you mind if we take a copy of this postcard? We'll do anything to find Harriet." James and Maria agreed, urging them to keep them updated. The drive back to Street Louis was silent. Elizabeth stared at the postcard, her mind full of what-ifs. Daniel, sensing her turmoil, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll find her," he said, yet doubt gnawed at Elizabeth. Would Harriet even want to be found? Back in Cedar Falls, Rebecca's health had improved enough for her to return home, though she required ongoing treatment. Daniel extended his stay, renting a small condo nearby so he could oversee the search for Harriet more effectively and help Rebecca as needed. Slowly, he and Rebecca began to speak, not about the past, but about practical matters. Their wounds were deep, but necessity forced them to cooperate. Elizabeth watched this fragile thaw with cautious hope. Meanwhile, she pinned Harriet's postcard to her bedroom mirror, determined not to let her sister vanish again. The question was how to proceed. A month later, the investigators turned up a possible lead. Harriet Nelson had used a social security number to apply for a job in Chicago 6 months prior. Elizabeth's heart soared. She and Daniel headed straight to the Windy City, combing through the last known addresses. They hit one dead end after another until they found a small cafe where Harriet had reportedly worked. The manager remembered her. She was quiet, sweet, called herself Hattie, worked here for a few weeks, then left without explanation. It was the same story repeated across Harriet's life, a transient existence. Elizabeth refused to give up. They learned Harriet occasionally visited a homeless shelter nearby. She was known to volunteer, giving out meals and sorting donations. Staff at the shelter recalled a compassionate young woman who spoke little about her past. "She seemed haunted," said one volunteer, an older man named Michael Winston. Never talked about family, just drifted in and out. Elizabeth felt an ache in her chest. Harriet had been so close, building fleeting connections, then disappearing again. Could Harriet be afraid of something or someone? Daniel's face was grave. He remembered his own dangerous past. Could Harriet be running from the same shadows? After several days of fruitless searching, Elizabeth and Daniel prepared to return to Cedar Falls. Defeat weighed heavily on them. On a whim, Elizabeth left a contact number at the shelter, pleading with the staff to call if Harriet ever showed up again. That night, as they packed their bags in the hotel, Elizabeth's phone rang. It was the shelter. Harriet was there. Elizabeth's heart nearly burst. She and Daniel rushed out into the rainy Chicago night, adrenaline fueling their steps. The city lights blurred as they sped through the streets, uncertain what awaited them at the shelter's modest entrance. They arrived to find Harriet standing near the entrance, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She looked older than Elizabeth expected, tired eyes, slender figure wrapped in a threadbare jacket, their gazes locked, both women seeing a reflection of themselves. Daniel approached cautiously. "Harriet?" His voice trembled. She blinked, stepping back, unsure. Elizabeth spoke gently. "We've been looking for you for months." I'm Elizabeth, your sister. Harriet's lips parted in shock. Slowly, her guarded expression softened. She glanced at Daniel, reading the same features in his face. In that rain-soaked moment, time stretched. Finally, Harriet whispered, "I remember your faces. From pictures, the reunion was cautious." Harriet had built walls around her heart, shaped by years of abandonment. She asked about Rebecca. "Is she alive?" Harriet's voice broke slightly. Elizabeth explained Rebecca's illness, her remission, and the guilt she carried. Tears filled Harriet's eyes. "I thought you forgot about me," she whispered. Daniel stepped forward, voice heavy with remorse. "I'm sorry, Harriet. The first never stopped looking. I made so many mistakes." Harriet studied him. "You're Daniel Hastings, right? The man with a criminal past, rumored to be a millionaire. Why are you here?" Her question sliced through the air like a blade. Daniel inhaled, raw guilt surfacing. "Because I can't undo the past," he answered quietly. "But I can try to atone. Your sister deserves to know you. Your mother wants to see you. We all owe you the life you never had." Harriet trembled, tears mixing with the rain. Elizabeth stepped forward, gently touching Harriet's shoulder. "Will you come with us? At least to see Mom?" Harriet hesitated. "She left me." Despite everything, Harriet's voice carried a childlike vulnerability. Elizabeth shook her head. She never wanted to. Circumstances spun out of control. "Please, Harriet, hear her side. Then decide if you can forgive us." Exhausted, Harriet agreed. They found a modest hotel for the night, the sisters sharing a room for the first time in their lives. They talked until dawn, uncovering each other's histories in hushed voices. Harriet had bounced between foster homes, adopting the name Hattie to distance herself from a painful childhood. She'd run away at 16, traveling across the country, never feeling like she belonged. In that tiny hotel room, a fragile bond began to form. Elizabeth shared their mother's story, her own struggles at the cafe, and the sudden reappearance of Daniel. By sunrise, they reached a tentative truce. The next day, they drove back to Cedar Falls. The atmosphere in the car was tense but hopeful. Harriet stared out the window, absorbing the unfamiliar yet strangely comforting landscapes. When they finally arrived at the Rogers' modest home, Harriet hesitated on the doorstep. Elizabeth led the way. Inside, Rebecca sat in an armchair, looking frail but alert. At the sight of Harriet, tears coursed down Rebecca's cheeks. "My baby girl," she whispered. Harriet stood rooted, uncertain. Then, slowly, she approached her mother. In that moment, decades of grief poured out. They embraced, both sobbing, forging a fragile bridge over lost time. The days that followed were raw and emotional. Harriet confronted Rebecca about the choices that led to her abandonment. Rebecca wept, detailing how Daniel's criminal entanglements had put them all in danger. Harriet listened, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks as she realized her mother's fear had been real. And yet, Harriet also bore scars from a childhood of drifting through the foster system. She demanded to know why no one found her sooner. Daniel admitted his failures, confessing the years spent in prison, the inadequate searches, and his own guilt that had paralyzed him. It was a storm of pain and regret. Out of this storm, however, came a sense of catharsis. Harriet, fragile and guarded, realized her mother and father had suffered too. Elizabeth, the youngest, struggled to balance her own resentment with gratitude that her family was, in some small way, reuniting. Daniel took charge, ensuring Harriet had a room of her own in the condo he rented. He enrolled her in therapy sessions, hoping to help her heal from years of trauma. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Harriet began to bond over simple things, cooking breakfast together, watching old movies on TV, sharing late-night conversations about the lives they'd led apart. Rebecca's health, buoyed by the joy of Harriet's return, seemed to improve. She remained physically weak, but emotionally, she brightened, cherishing the second chance at a relationship with her lost daughter. Daniel spent more time in Cedar Falls than ever before. His business associates in New York were surprised by his extended absence, but he assured them he was handling personal matters. For Elizabeth, it was surreal. The father she once hated was now an integral part of her life. She still harbored unresolved anger, but seeing how he supported Harriet and their mother slowly thawed her bitterness. Then came the twist that would shatter the fragile peace. One evening while Daniel was out, Harriet stumbled across a file in his condo. It contained documents detailing Daniel's business dealings, some of which appeared questionable. There were references to offshore accounts, legal disputes, and sealed court records. A series of criminal investigations had apparently been closed, but the details were murky. Shocked, Harriet shared her discovery with Elizabeth. Fear crept back into their minds. Had Daniel truly reformed, or was he still entangled in something dangerous? The seeds of doubt were planted anew, threatening to uproot everything they'd rebuilt. They confronted Daniel. He admitted that while most of his business was legitimate, he'd used shell companies and offshore accounts in the past, a remnant of trying to hide from old enemies. He insisted he was clean now, but Harriet and Elizabeth exchanged skeptical glances. Rebecca, tired of secrets, demanded the full truth. Daniel finally confessed there were still people who wanted him to pay for old betrayals. He'd come to Cedar Falls partly to protect his family, fearing these enemies might trace him. Anger rippled through the house. Once again, Daniel's secrets had brought danger to their door. That very night, a black SUV was spotted idling outside Rebecca's home. Harriet peered through the curtains, heart pounding. Daniel's face went pale when he saw it. "They found me," he murmured. Panic erupted. Rebecca insisted that Harriet and Elizabeth stay inside while Daniel called the police. The SUV sped away before authorities arrived, leaving behind an echo of threat. In the following days, Daniel arranged security, determined not to let harm befall his family again. The sisters grappled with the harsh reality that, despite his wealth and attempts at redemption, Daniel's past still cast a long, dangerous shadow. And so, the family found itself in a crucible of redemption and risk. Harriet, reluctant to trust, hesitated between staying or fleeing again. Rebecca, physically exhausted, tried to hold her fractured family together. Elizabeth, once just a humble waitress, became the emotional glue, urging them to stand united. Daniel, racked by guilt, resolved to face his enemies rather than run. Over several tense weeks, he cooperated with law enforcement, turning over evidence on individuals connected to his criminal history. In doing so, he risked everything: his fortune, even his safety. Yet, for once in his life, he put family before self-preservation. Finally, in a dramatic turn, federal agents arrested several key figures linked to Daniel's past crimes, neutralizing the threat. With this specter lifted, Daniel was free to be the father he'd never been. Harriet and Elizabeth watched as he faced the consequences of his cooperation, costly legal battles, a damaged business reputation. But Daniel embraced these hardships as a form of karmic justice. He'd lived lavishly on ill-gotten gains. Now he was determined to rebuild ethically. Harriet saw in him a man genuinely striving to change. Elizabeth, still cautious, acknowledged the sincere effort behind his atonement. Life settled into a new normal. Harriet stayed in Cedar Falls, forging a relationship with Rebecca and Elizabeth. She began therapy, confronting her feelings of abandonment and discovering a sense of belonging. Elizabeth continued at the cafe, though Daniel encouraged her to pursue bigger dreams, offering to fund her education if she wished. Rebecca's health steadily improved, with Daniel paying for top-notch medical care. Despite the tensions, a sense of unity emerged, woven from adversity. They had lost so much time, but somehow They'd found a fragile redemption. Even in the face of mistakes and regrets, a family was slowly healing. One cold winter morning, Elizabeth glanced at the cafe window and saw a solitary figure outside. She froze, recognizing the tailored suit, the salt and pepper hair. Only this time, Daniel wasn't just a stranger leaving cryptic notes. He was her father, who had finally chosen to stand by her. She stepped outside. A gentle snow fell around them. Daniel offered a small smile. "Mind if I come in for coffee?" Elizabeth nodded, returning the smile hesitantly. Together, they walked inside. The once empty seat at the cafe counter no longer belonged to a mysterious stranger, but to a father, trying with all his might to make amends. Harriet soon found a part-time job at a local bookstore, her love for reading offering solace from years of wandering. Rebecca, regaining strength, decided to volunteer at a cancer support group, sharing her story to help others find hope. Elizabeth, spurred by Daniel's encouragement, enrolled in night classes at a community college. Even though she was wary of depending on his money, she also recognized that this opportunity might never come again. She vowed to make the most of it. Each step forward felt like a collective triumph, a testament to resilience and a reminder that healing often follows the deepest wounds. In time, Harriet and Elizabeth grew inseparable, making up for lost years. They often stayed up late, giggling over childhood stories. Though Harriet's childhood had been far from happy, they discovered a shared passion for cooking, experimenting with new recipes in Elizabeth's tiny apartment kitchen. Daniel and Rebecca watched this transformation with tearful joy. The two daughters, once separated by circumstances, now bonded by empathy and compassion. It wasn't perfect. Old resentments and new conflicts flared occasionally, but they faced each storm together. The Rogers-Hastings family had been fractured, but slowly it was rebuilding itself on a foundation of honesty and forgiveness. As for Daniel, he spent a year untangling his business affairs, guided by a newfound moral compass. His net worth diminished, but he accepted it. What mattered was that he was no longer running from his past. Each weekend, he'd join Harriet and Elizabeth for family dinners at Rebecca's house. Laughter echoed in the living room, a sound that had been absent for far too long. On one such evening, as Harriet braided Elizabeth's hair, Rebecca remarked with a trembling smile, "I can't believe this is real, all of us here together." Daniel, looking around at the family he'd nearly lost, echoed her sentiment. "Neither can I." And then came the day of Rebecca's final chemotherapy session. The room was filled with cautious optimism. Harriet and Elizabeth flanked their mother, while Daniel offered silent support from a corner chair. As the nurse removed, the fourth tears of relief and gratitude streamed down Rebecca's face. After 2 harrowing years, she was declared cancer-free. Outside the hospital, they embraced in the sunshine, a moment suspended in time. Harriet whispered, "Thank you for fighting, Mom." Elizabeth added, "We need you." Rebecca smiled, eyes flicking to Daniel. "I finally have my family back. I wasn't going to give up now." In celebration, they gathered at Millwood's Cafe, a full-circle moment for Elizabeth, who had served countless plates of pancakes and coffee here, never imagining such a transformation. Rosie, her co-worker, brought out a small cake, iced with the words, "Welcome back, Harriet, and congratulations, Rebecca." Harriet blushed, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers who had become like neighbors. Rebecca sipped tea, relieved that her life no longer hung in the balance. Daniel paid for everyone's meal, leaving a tip that matched the entire bill, yet this time it was not about flashing wealth. It was a heartfelt gesture of gratitude to the place that had brought him back to his family. In the weeks that followed, Harriet and Elizabeth gradually told the cafe regulars their story, how a slip of paper left with a bill had sparked a chain reaction of revelations. People listened, enthralled. The small town of Cedar Falls, once overshadowed by secrets, now witnessed a family's rebirth. Word spread about the millionaire father who had once been a criminal, returning to make amends. Instead of judgment, many offered support, perhaps because they saw the genuine change in him. It wasn't every day that an estranged family found each other again under such dramatic circumstances, but life has a way of testing newfound harmony. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Daniel notice of a lawsuit filed by some former associates claiming financial damages. The spectre of his past would not vanish quietly. Fearing this legal battle might drain his resources and drag the family back into chaos, Daniel warned Rebecca and the girls. Harriet, terrified of losing her new stability, contemplated running again. Elizabeth, however, refused to allow fear to dictate their lives. They decided to face it as a united front. The old Daniel would have fled or used illegal means to fix it. The new Daniel hired legitimate lawyers, prepared to fight honestly. The court case became a media spectacle, local news outlets sniffing a story of a reformed criminal millionaire facing his past. Paparazzi occasionally lurked outside the cafe, hoping for a scandalous scoop. Elizabeth tried to shield Harriet from the spotlight. Harriet, though still fragile, mustered courage. "I won't run anymore," she told Elizabeth, the first tired of being afraid. At the preliminary hearing, Daniel pleaded no contest to certain financial improprieties, but argued the plaintiffs were equally complicit. In a surprising turn, evidence emerged that the associates had engaged in far worse crimes. Their claims collapsed. Daniel reached a settlement, financially painful but morally cleansing. The settlement nearly wiped out Daniel's fortune. Hastings and Associates was sold off to pay debts and legal fees. By the end of the ordeal, he was far from a millionaire. Yet, strangely, Daniel felt lighter than he had in decades. He left the courthouse flanked by Harriet and Elizabeth, with Rebecca waiting outside. Reporters snapped photos of the family, hoping for a salacious quote. Instead, Daniel simply said, "I'm free." Harriet took his hand. "So am I," she whispered. In that moment, father and daughter found common ground in their shared desire to forge an honest future, unburdened by past sins. The story of Daniel Hastings and his family became local legend, whispered about in diners and living rooms throughout Cedar Falls. Some criticized the choices he'd made, others admired his transformation, but for Elizabeth, Harriet, and Rebecca, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had each other, and the secrets that once drove them apart had finally been dragged into the light. Over the months that followed, they established a peaceful routine. Daniel bought a modest home in town. Rebecca recovered enough to garden and teach knitting classes at the community center. Harriet continued therapy, healing slowly, day by day. Elizabeth pursued a degree in social work, inspired by her sister's painful journey through foster care. She vowed to become an advocate for children who, like Harriet, felt abandoned. During her free time, she and Harriet volunteered at local shelters, distributing food and offering a listening ear to runaway teens. It was a labor of love and penance for a family that had once been shattered by secrets. Each day, Elizabeth marveled at how dramatically her life had changed since that night at Millwood's cafe when Daniel left that fateful note. She had found her father, her sister, and, against all odds, hope. One evening, Harriet and Elizabeth visited the cafe after hours. The neon sign buzzed, the kitchen closed, but Rosie let them in for a late-night snack. They sat in the same booth Daniel had occupied months earlier. "Remember when everything started here?" Elizabeth said, running her hand over the worn tabletop. Harriet nodded, tears in her eyes. "Back then, I was convinced I had no family. Now I have a mother, a father, and a sister who mean everything." They clinked soda glasses in a quiet toast, acknowledging both the darkness they'd overcome and the light that guided them forward. At home, Daniel often reflected on the nature of karma. For years, He'd benefited from illicit deals, building wealth on shaky foundations. Karma eventually caught up with him, costing him his freedom, his family, and, at last, his fortune. Yet, through this downfall, he gained something infinitely more valuable: redemption, acceptance, and genuine love from the daughters he'd wronged. Perhaps hard karma had indeed come full circle, forcing him to confront his misdeeds and embrace the consequences. In this real-life drama, the final chapter wasn't about riches, but about the immeasurable wealth of a reunited family that refused to let the past destroy its future. Years later, Elizabeth would record the events in a journal, detailing every twist of the story that began with a simple note left on a cafe table: "From your father, the millionaire." She concluded that while money can solve some problems like medical bills, it can't repair broken hearts without sincere effort and truth. In the end, the Hastings-Rogers family learned that the path to forgiveness is paved with honesty, empathy, and a willingness to face your darkest mistakes. And so, from a legacy of secrets, they forged a new narrative, a testament to the power of family bonds, even when tested by betrayal and time. Thank you for joining us on this roller coaster of revelations, heartbreak, and second chances. The real-life drama of Elizabeth Rogers and her family shows us that the path to redemption can be treacherous, but the rewards, love, forgiveness, and unity are beyond measure. From a hidden sister to a father's criminal past, every twist led them closer to the truth. Through it all, they discovered that real wealth doesn't lie in dollar signs or lavish estates, but in the healing of old wounds and the creation of new beginnings. If you were moved by this story, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more riveting, heartfelt tales to life. Until next time, remember, no matter how deep the scars, hope and love can guide us toward a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for watching.